Watrous by Hallie Blum on November 21, 1985. Do you want to start, Peg, and give us a little bit on your very earliest memories of Madison?
Or can I go back further than that?
Oh, you certainly may. That would be excellent.
Yeah. No, I was not born in Madison. I was born in Williston, North Dakota, which surprises everybody. A lot of people are born in North Dakota but don't stay there. And I was there for 4 years because my father was the first dentist in Williston, North Dakota. We lived in a bungalow-type house that didn't have running water, and about all I remember of it was we had a coal stove with a, what do you call those things that kept coal? A scuttle, coal scuttle.
Yeah.
And I used to help myself to the coal and eat it, which worried my mother that there was something lacking in my diet, and I'm sure there was, or I would have not have done that, but she could always tell from the look of my mouth. We were living across the street from the J.W. Jackson home, which was a big brick house with 6 children, and they were my cousins. One of them was my best friend, Miriam, who was just my age, and I think I spent more time over there. I was at that time an only child, my older sister having died the year before because there was an epidemic. I suppose it was typhoid, and all the babies under 1 year died that year, and that would have been 1909 because I was born in November of 1910.
Could we stop here?
Yeah, goes through pretty well. I said that I was a frequent visitor at the Jackson house. I certainly was. Mrs. Jackson loved children. That was Julia. And she welcomed me into the home, and I spent a good deal of time there. I've called her my stay-at-home mother, and my own mother was the gadabout mother. I also had my own little private entourage of friends who were imaginative. Mrs. Pipes and Mrs. Sontz and Mrs. Modie, and I used to have tea parties for them, and I really thought they were real people. I suppose I was, being an only child, had to dream up something. I can recall very little about Williston except that there were no trees. And when we moved to Madison when I was 4, I was afraid of the trees. And we stayed part of the time at my grandparents' home on Gilman Street, one of those big sandstone houses with trees in the yard, of which I was afraid. And I had an uncle living there who had a beard, and I was afraid of the beard and the trees. I suppose I spent a good deal of time in the vestibule. That summer, my parents were house parents for the Tridelt sorority. We lived in the old Keenan house up on Gilman Street. They call it Big Bug Hill now, across from the Pierce house. And I don't remember much about that except it had bed bugs.
What was the name of your grandparents that lived on Gilman?
My grandparents were Joseph W. Hobbins and his wife Mary, or Minnie as she was called popularly, Minnie Mears Hobbins, who had been born and raised across the street in one of those old landmark homes now. It still looks the same as I recall it 70 years ago. But after the end of that summer of 19 I suppose it was 14, we moved to my grandparents' house, not knowing whether we would stay. My father became the first dentist at the Jackson Clinic, which was run by all of the Jackson brothers, who were my mother's cousins. They had never had a dentist before. He stayed there for a while and then became a dentist in private practice. First on Main Street over the Capital City Bank, and then on Pinckney over Simpson's, and later moved to grander quarters in the First National Trust building on Pinckney. I can't recall the proper title for that. Up on the 6th floor, right next to the clinic, Cooksey, Nesbitt, Harper, Sisk, and so forth. He was not in the same office, but next to it. They had all been in the medical unit, Red Arrow unit, during the war, First World War. So my father continued as a dentist, but became ultimately a dental surgeon, which is what he always wanted to do. My grandparents' home was an enormous house with a barn, and there was a horse and a buggy, because I remember driving around the square, or riding around the square in the buggy with those little balls bobbing about at the top and going the wrong way around the square, which people find very amusing now. The house was, as I say, awfully big. It is now, I'm told, divided into 18 efficiency apartments. So you can see how large it was. It was called the First Ward and was a block away from Lake Mendota, which then was called Fourth Lake. Monona being third, Wabisa being second, Kegonsa being First Lake. I was still an only child, although there were more born after I, but none of them lived. So I was an only child in an enormously large family with uncles and aunts popping in all the time. There were always 10 or 12 for meals. My grandmother did a good deal of the cooking, but mostly after a while she had maids. And I even had a nursemaid during the war, because my mother had to go down to my grandfather's bank, where he was president. It was the Capital City Bank on the East Main, I suppose. So I was accustomed to a large number of grown-ups. My mother thought I was going to be rotten spoiled. And so there was across the street from us on Gilman a little private school, Mrs. Davis's school, which later became the Madison Day School. And I was put into the first grade, there being no kindergartens at that time. There were 4 of us in that grade. As I recall, there were Henry Bunting, Melvin Terry, and Theodore Dodge, and me. There was nothing very astonishing about me, but the others were all brilliant kids, and we were all in the 4 to 5 year old classification in age. And we all went through the day school into Wisconsin High School, the old University High School, and into college together, which is rather remarkable, I guess. There were family gatherings all the time. My goodness, I can hardly remember when there weren't any. And at Christmas, people came from Denver and Chicago, Butte, Montana, places like that. And the Christmas tree mysteriously showed up in the parlor on Christmas Day, and the parlor was unlocked, and we kids, which numbered about 18 and I suppose, or maybe more. My grandparents had 8 children, and there were 16 of us grandchildren, but there were always additional people here and there. And that Christmas tree was simply astonishing. We don't know how it got there, but apparently everybody had a gay old time the night before putting it up and decorating it. There were, in that part of town, I'm told, 14 related families within 2 blocks. I can't quite imagine that happening anymore, but I suppose it does some places. So there were cousins and...
Can you give us some of the names?
Well, there was the Reg Jackson household, Dr. Reg Jackson, surgeon at the clinic, and his wife's sister, and there was the Palmer family across the street. My grandfather's brother, Harry Hobbins, and his wife, and numerous people in his wife's family. They're all a blur now because I just considered them people. I didn't think of them as anything special, but now I realize. There was the Suhr family right behind us, S-U-H-R, into which my oldest uncle had married. And it was quite a remarkable neighborhood when I think back on it. Our back door neighbor sideways was Tom Mendenhall and his brother John. And Tom later became president of Smith College. And there was Herbie Page and Carl Russell Fish and the Bunn family. And I'm told Thornton Wilder was up on the corner near where the Delta Gamma house is now. We had the Motts painting family on one side of us and the Findorf building family on the other side of us, which, as I think about it now, was rather interesting. My best friend, after my cousin Miriam, was Helen Motts, who lived next door. She was a year or two older than I, and we were quite inseparable. We had playmates, too. Patty Mason, Stedman, Catherine Sheldon, oh goodness, lots of others. But Helen and I used to sit on the horse block out in front of my grandparents' house and watch for the man who had the street light. Turner Honor, I can't recall the name of the thing, but we would watch for him to come.
Was this gas?
Yes, yeah, it was gas. And we would watch for him to come and run to the corner of Carroll and Gilman and watch him lower something and light it and then raise it up again, and on he'd go, waving to us as he left. Another favorite sport of ours was to walk to the Mott's Paint Company down on the corner of the Square and Carroll. It had 2 entrances, one on Carroll, one on State, and we would walk with her father to his place of business and he'd always give us some pieces of paint samples, and we ultimately took orange crates and put wallpaper inside and made dollhouses out of that. I thought that was the greatest, and so did she. My grandparents had a big porch, and we installed our little dollhouses there, small dolls. Her family were the Grays, and my family were the Chase families. Yes, there were streetcars. My grandfather and I would take the streetcar down on State Street at the end of Gilman with hoes and trowels and other garden paraphernalia and ride out to the corner of Breese Terrace and Chadron. And his garden, he being an Englishman, born in England, felt that gardening was the most important thing outside of banking, raising his family, and I would help him dig around in the garden. It was a wonderful garden, and we later, after he died, inherited the property and built our family home there. That was in 1921, after the war. My mother was worried that I was going to be spoiled, as I said, so she would send me down to Chicago, Oak Park to be exact, to spend time with my cousins there, the Harry Hobbins family, because they had 3 boys and a girl, and they all punched me and pulled my hair, and I learned to fight back, which I didn't have a chance to do in a household of grown-ups. I didn't think the idea was so good, but my mother did. She thought everybody should learn this. She, as the youngest of 8 children, used to eat the frosting on her cake first for fear her brothers would take their forks and spear over and get hers before she had a chance to eat it. So this was the sort of thing she thought I should be exposed to. I was. As though, as I recall, it was ripe olives we were all after down there in Chicago. The milkmen came with, I think it was Kennedy Dairy, came with wagons and horses, and the horses knew exactly where to stop. And while men were delivering, the milkman would go in and deliver the milk, which was considerable at our house, and then the Kennedy Dairy horse would plod on down to the next house, and he seemed to know exactly where to stop. Had nothing more on his mind. Bicycles, my goodness, my mother would no more allow me to ride a bicycle than take an airplane ride. It was too dangerous. Those wild students up on Langdon Street might run into me, or I might run into them. Heaven only knows what would have happened. And I don't recall anybody my age having a bicycle, living on Gilman Street. I do remember the water tower on East Washington Avenue. Lowell Fauci lived down in there someplace, very close. He has a very good impressions of that. And I think there was a trough, water trough for horses to be watered there. Family outings. We didn't have any, except when we got a car, and that wasn't until after we moved to Spooner Street. I should go back to say that the house that we built on the plot where my grandfather had his garden was according to my wishes, and it still remains. It's a little white colonial type house with shutters, with a fence around it. My Uncle Dick had a car. It was a gorgeous Hudson, and every time he had a chance he would take me out in it and say, "Where should we go?" And I'd say, out to those darling little doll houses in Hillington. So we would go out to Hillington and look at those little white houses, which to me were just like a toy village. And I said to my mother, if we ever build a house, I want it to look just like that. And she said, well, we'll think about it. So when my grandfather died in 1920, which was a big shock to everyone, obviously we finally got around to building this little house, which is still there, 2 houses north of Randall School, and it looks the same as it ever did, except that a garage was put in the backyard. There is no garden. The asparagus bed is gone, and that was a gorgeous thing. Too bad. But we built the house according to what my mother and I put on the back of an envelope. And she had a sister who lived on Hoyt Street, Midge, whose husband, Frank Woy, taught electrical engineering at the university, but actually he had a degree in architecture from somewhere, Colorado, I think. And he helped us plan the house. And it's just for a small family. But I lived there from 7th grade, which would have been my first year at the old university high school, called Fool's Retreat by some, but not by me, and all through high school. So I went there 6 years. And it was a wonderful place to get an education.
When did you move to the Spooner Street house?
1921.
Ah.
On November 11th. My father wanted it to be a memorable day because that was Armistice Day, the day he was relieved of the war and came home. Probably the most exciting day that anyone in our household ever remembered. And then life changed considerably. I never went to Randall, even though it was right there, but it just didn't work out that way. Our own family of children did. We occasionally did take picnics after we moved there and after we got a car, which was a Star. That was our first car. My father spent most of his waking hours when he wasn't working under the car, looking under the hood, petting it. And the man across the street did the same thing. And they would discuss this and that. It was pretty funny. I don't remember too much about swimming, but there was a lot of ice skating. My class of 7th grade, which included one of Hallie Lou's brothers, George, who was one of the handsome ones in the class. When we did go to picnics, it was most often to Hoyt Park, which was a marvelous place. You could look out over the East Hill Farms by standing on the brick stone wall and see the sheep grazing. Now you see the neon lights of Hilldale.
And you went in the quarry, I'll bet.
I suppose we did. I don't recall. One of our children fell down at the quarry once and was rescued by our then student who was living with us. But the fish hatchery, of course, was another place we went for picnics after we got our Star, which was, I think, followed by a Willie's Night. We spent a lot of time in the neighborhood playing Annie Annie over at Randall School, and as I recall, there were some, what did we call them, kiosks or small buildings out in back where we threw the ball to the other side. Those were built because there was such a large population of children, they needed extra
Yes.
housing for it. Of course, we did roller skating and hopscotch and other games, but at that, in 7th grade, I can recall we were still playing with dolls, which is a horrible thought these days. I don't recall any particular games, but we certainly played after supper in the summer. I went 2 years to Washington School after Miss Davis's because my mother thought I was getting a little too precious in education, and I needed to meet the hoi polloi. So we went to Washington. I went to Washington School for 5th and 6th grades, and was utterly miserable. Partly because I had to take music lessons and go over to the Wheeler School of Music on State Street, and apparently I wasn't very good because it didn't last long. But then, happily, Wisconsin High School welcomed me. I can remember my first day wearing a dark blue knit dress with little white eyelets in it and panties to match that showed. I thought it was glorious. Wisconsin High was, as I said, was a wonderful place to go to school. It was small. Mr. Miller was a very compassionate principal. He had a drawer in his own private desk where we could put special things that we wanted to bring to school. I remember Ann Micklejohn bringing her dolls and putting 1 or 2 of them in that drawer with something or other that I had. My class went from 7th grade on through to senior high almost without change. But there appeared, when I was a junior, a new boy in school. Oh, was he glorious. He came from Kansas, and he came because the Pop Gordon family persuaded the Watrous family, who had lived in the same town of Winfield, Kansas, that they should move to Madison, which they did. And Jim, who was the youngest of 4, went to Wisconsin High School. He was very talented. He sang and he played the violin, and he played basketball because anybody from Kansas was to play basketball. Didn't matter if they were any good. But that was one of the things Kansas was noted for. And the coach said, "You're in." So Jim was the 10th on the team. He's not sure he ever got off the bench, but there he was. At any rate, all the girls were gaga over this new boy, which didn't happen very often. You got a new member of the class. And so after they all got through clamoring for his attention, I was the only one left over. And apparently I won out. He's still around. We used to have our lunch outside of school on that knoll, I can't remember the name of it now, in front of high school. And then we would often go up to King Hall and get a paper cup with buttermilk in it, which is free. You had to pay for the cup, but the buttermilk was free. I didn't like it, but it was something we all did. Sports, oh yes, we were all in every team. We played hockey, field hockey, over where Camp Randall is, before they made it into a living quarters for families during World War II. Schoolmates, I had 3 who were, the 4 of us were inseparable. There was Ella von Krug, Ellsworth Mosby, and Louise Wagner, whose father was Professor Wagner of zoology. High school was very memorable. I can recall my teachers perfectly, one of whom is still alive, and she lives at Gaylord. Field hockey was wonderful. I was a lot better at that than I was at basketball, but in our small school they had to use everybody. So whatever, if you had two legs, you were moving at something. We all had sleds, of course, and ice skates, and I recall mostly ice skates on Lake Wingra, the lagoons over there, and occasionally we'd walk over to Picnic Point and skate back across the ice. And then our class would have a snow picnic, an outdoor picnic. The boys would make the fire, and we girls would cook the weenies.
Oh, neat.
And as far as I know, that's all we had, but I don't recall that part. I don't remember any ice boating. I do remember watching it.
Was the ski jump in operation then? On
Which one?
the one over the hill that came down on Lake Mendota?
I recall that when I worked at the Union,
Ah, yeah.
much later.
Yes.
Skiing was unknown, so far as I know. My first pair of skis I still have, and they're downstairs and waiting to be given to the Hoofers someday as
A museum
a
item.
late museum item. That's right. I did a lot of fishing with my grandfather at First Lake. He had a little shack over there. And we caught perch and what they call pickerel. I don't even know if they have pickerel anymore.
Out on the ice, you mean?
No, this was
Oh. In the summer.
in the summer. I see fishing here. But
Yeah.
Church, good heavens, it seemed to me I spent all my time there. First at Grace Church, and then when we moved out west to Spooner Street, I went to the St. Andrews, which was then on that little court near the Clarendon Apartments. I can't
Oh,
remember the
right.
name of that court. There is, I think, another kind of church there now, or school. It seemed to me I was always at church. There was something going on. But I had activities galore. When I went to Washington School 2 years, I was in the Kale School of the Dance with Professor Kale, who wore a tall black silk hat and patent leather shoes with bows and carried a cane. And as far as I know, there was only one other gentleman in town who did, and that was Mr. Montgomery, who ran the streetcar company. And he would stand on the street corners watching his streetcars go to make sure everything went well. We had cotillions in our class, which of course we looked forward to. But that ended after those 2 years at Washington School. I did have some music lessons, but we had French in Madison Day School. We started the whole school with a French class. All the doors were opened up between the rooms, and we learned our French. And the first song we learned was La Marseillaise. I could sing it pretty much still the same. Now, there were no Girl Scouts. There was the not high wide, but what did they call the girls that went to the YWCA? There was a name for it, but it was the same as High Y for girls. And we used to have our outings over here in the Bethel Methodist Church on Mineral Point Road, which was way out in the country then. That was overnights. In high school, there were the Al Jackson Players downtown in the old Madison Theater, I think. It may not have been called that then, but Agatha Carlin was our heroine, and we went every Friday afternoon. It was a repertory theater, and there was a new play every week. And the Al Jackson Players were simply marvelous. And when Al Jackson played in The Cat and the Canary, he had to be locked up in a closet for a while, and they opened the door of the closet, and out fell Al Jackson in this play. And when he fell one time, he broke his jaw, and my father had the privilege of setting his jaw, which I thought was one of the high points of my life, was to think my father was connected to that. We enjoyed in high school singing for Pop Gordon, Professor E.B. Gordon, who was, of course, a great friend of the Watrous family. In fact, he took our wedding pictures for us. My mother used to think that I should have dancing parties at home. She would plan them and think that we should have some people from all over town. So she got them from somewhere. I don't know, but they were pretty deadly because nobody knew each other. I would think she would have known better, but she didn't. And after all the preparations of taking up the rugs and all the food and all, the boys all stood on one side of the room, the girls on the other. And it was absolutely a colossal failure. We went to all the basketball games, Wisconsin high school basketball games. And once in a while we won. Not often. We went to a lot of fairs and circuses, and the parades around the square were absolutely marvelous, because I could go to my father's office on the second floor and look down on these things, and it was lots and lots of my friends would be up there with us, and we had a great time. My father would have to do his work someplace else, I guess. The county fairs were marvelous. There were everything under the sun. I didn't care about the quilts, but animals and the Kewpie dolls and horse racing. I was crazy about horses. As a matter of fact, most of the time in high school I was on a horse. There was a woman named Mary Holt who lived over in Briar Hill down near Lake Wingra, and she had 4 horses. A number of us took horseback riding lessons with her. And I did that all during high school and into college. And it was considered my sport. About the only thing I was ever good at, I think. When I went to college, my mother felt that I should live at home my first year, and my cousin from Oak Park came and lived with us, and that was nice, except that she was terribly bright and I was terribly dull, and she could write a theme in half an hour while it took me a couple of days.
Was she also a freshman?
Yes,
Oh,
we
dear.
were both freshmen.
Oh, dear.
And I don't recall being terribly upset about it, except that I had to spend a good deal more time working than she did. And Then my family in Oak Park reciprocated by having me when I graduated. Lived down there for a year while I went to business college. That was a nice reciprocation. My father decided to give up dentistry my senior year in high school, but my mother stayed on to chaperone my cousin and me, my cousin Harriet and me, so that we got into college properly, chaperoned, and we would come home by streetcar. Came and went without any thoughts of danger of any kind. And then I moved downtown to the Delta Gamma house for the next 3 years. I don't know how much more how much further you want to go into this.
I was wondering, something that you've been deeply interested in was the Conservancy movement in Madison. Were you in on that in the early days?
No, not till 1966, when Paul Olson, who was principal at Midvale School, was one of the people who started the Nature Conservancy. That was a national organization. Wisconsin had none, and there were a number of people who started. Hugh Willis, Joe Hickey, Gene Bork, and at the moment I can't think of the others, but Paul Olson retrieved most of us people from one thing or another. Van Taylor had been membership secretary, but she got so involved in so many things that she suggested that he find somebody else to take her place while she helped, but didn't have to do the secretarial work. So I took over in the fall of '66, recruiting new members, and it was hard going at first, and I worked long and hard, but it was satisfying, and I got a great many friends, pen pals, you might say, over the years. Emily Early, next door, was the stewardship chairman, and she worked hard and long taking care of the properties, and it has now blossomed. Whereas I had maybe 200-300 members when we started, they now have in the area of 6,000.
In the state?
Yes,
That's wonderful.
just in the state.
Mm-hmm.
The new membership chairman, Sharon Gaskill, has done a wonderful job, as have all the other people in the staff and volunteers. Only 4 people on the staff, and you'd never know how much work they turn out. I also work at unskilled labor at the Arboretum.
Is that part of the Conservancy movement, or is that a separate?
At the Arboretum?
Yes.
No, that's university. University Arboretum. I had the chairman of, the director, I should say, of the Arboretum was Kathy Bradley, who lived next door, and Emily Early on the other side was on the Arboretum committee. So I minded my P's and Q's and tried not to offend anybody by driving too fast or any of that. Then I worked a little bit at the Albion when they need people to stuff envelopes, do other menial tasks. But that's fun because you can talk and work at the same time, and you're through and you don't have to carry over. So those are my
And you did
things.
something with politics back in the...
Well, I worked at the union,
Mm-hmm.
student union, from 1932 to the spring of '39, and that was hard going. That was about a 25-hour-a-day job. The students, of course, had lots of time to come to the union and sit around and talk. Expected that you would also, whereas you were trying to get something done. I had gone to business college the year before. As I said, I lived with my uncle's family down in Oak Park. And I got Chicago out of my mind easily. It didn't take long before I had a job opening in Madison, and I came back and worked at the union where I'd done volunteer work in my student days. It was fun, and I learned to know a great many students well, most of them the BMOC, the big man on campus type. A great many of them now have turned into very important people. Jim Doyle and Tom Fairchild, Gaylord Nelson, so many of them.
Right.
Carl Thompson, they've all gone on to bigger and better things. Horace Wilke, they sharpened their teeth on the union and then went out
In the big world.
into the big world.
Mm-hmm. And you knew Gaylord Nelson then as a student first.
Yeah, they're law students. But
Mm.
then they needed somebody to do, to read the newspapers and get the editorials and news stories about his activities. And Esther Kaplan asked me, she was his appointment secretary, asked me if I would come and do this job of the checking the papers. I enjoyed this. I always enjoy seeing what the papers around the state are saying about government. So I read all these little dailies and weeklies, and my job was to make a scrapbook of everything that I could get my hands on. And I mean everything, every little tidbit that had anything to do with Gaylord's activities,
Oh, yeah.
decisions. I also kept a file all the way from airplanes to zoning.
Of policies.
Yeah, of all kinds of clippings if I had extras or any papers, so that if he wanted to give a talk on agriculture, say, he could pull out that file, finger through it, and get ideas about what he wanted to say, so that his script writers could work with it.
Now these were issues and questions that not necessarily he'd had a statement on before, is that correct?
Yeah, if he were going to give a
Yeah.
talk,
That's great.
it would give him ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I also made a scrapbook for every month of those 4 years. There were 48 scrapbooks, all of which are still intact except 2 that disappeared. And I don't know how much rubber cement I used, but
Barrels.
it was certainly a great deal of it. And
Was this the period when he was
governor.
actually governor?
Yes.
He was actually in office.
So every month that he was governor, I kept a scrapbook for him. He took them to Washington with him, and as far as I know, they're still down there someplace.
Maybe they're in the Smithsonian.
Oh, yes, I'm sure. Archives. But if anybody ever wanted to write a master's or a doctor's thesis on what Gaylord said and did in those days, they'd have something to work with,
They certainly would.
at least from the point of view of the newspapers.
Right.
But it was fun because I could do it on my own time. And I got $75 a month, which came out of his own little pocket money that we could use for little things. $50 of which I got, and that took care of parking.
Oh, yes. Just about.
Just about it.
Yeah.
But it got me out, and I learned a great deal of what was going on. That would have been from 59 to 60, 2 or 3, somewhere around in there.
Did your mother ever live in Ashland, Wisconsin?
No.
Because Stella had said she thought your mother knew our mother, who came from Ashland and went to the university here.
What would have been her dates?
1906, 5.
Yeah, my mother graduated in 7.
Oh, she did?
7, yeah.
Well, then they might have known each other.
Oh,
at
I'm
the
sure they
campus.
did. What was
Yeah.
her maiden name?
Carlin, Hallie Carlin.
C-A-R.
L-I-N.
My mother was a great sportswoman, and she's organized the Women's Athletic Association.
And her maiden name was?
Hobbins.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah.
She was the youngest of these 4 boys and 4 girls. And from that tribe there became 16 grandchildren, 8 boys and 8 girls.
Oh.
And the Jackson family also was started with 8, and they had a great many children. So all these
numerous
people, oh my, very few of them are still around here.
That's
that
right,
is,
yeah, in this area.
Yeah. Reg Jackson was my age, and he lives out at Breese Point, which is his family
That on
cottage.
one of the lakes?
Yeah, it's on Fourth Lake, or Mendota. There's Picnic Point, and then there's another
Oh, the next
little point over, and that's called Breese Point,
Ah,
after which Breese Terrace is named, and Breese Stevens Field. It's that family of Breese. Many people call it Breeze, but it's not. It's Breese.
Breese.
B-R-E-E-S-E.
Oh, there's no Z at all.
No. But I can remember your family at 208 Highland Avenue,
Right.
because I would often go that way to school. Down on University Avenue. But generally I went direct.
And you walked to Wisconsin High?
Oh yeah.
That was quite a way.
From Spooner Street?
Oh, not bad, no.
No.
I was thinking from here.
No. No, it was gone. We went to the disintegration of
Wisconsin High?
Wisconsin High. And while we dreaded going, it seemed so awful.
Right.
We had a perfectly wonderful time.
Oh,
Seeing each other and
yeah.
enjoying each other again.
I guess Gladys Borchert was in on that
Oh,
final
sure she
stage.
was. Sure she was. And she would remember some of it. And there were others, of course, at that time, too. Was that about 57 or so?
I remember Mary Zillman and Mary Ravell and Richard Zillman were
Yes.
involved.
Yeah.
They were still there and they had to get out.
Well, Richard Zillman and Richard McCabe and Tom Watrous were the terrors of University Nursery School.
Oh, my.
And they would no sooner arrive to age 3 or 4 than they would, then all hell would break loose, and the teachers would grit their teeth and prepare to try to untangle them. And I think our child was the worst. But they've all turned out to be respectable people now, with respectable jobs. But it was the head teacher's fault that we had this third child, who was such a hellion. She said, "Your first 2 have been such wonderful children, I think you should have another." So we had another, and I think she ruled the day she
never
made the
said.
suggestion.
And what period would that have been when they were in the nursery?
In nursery school, Tom was born in 46, so it would have been about 49.
Is there still a university nursery
Yes,
school
there
going?
is. And 1 or 2 of our grandchildren went there. We used to take Meg there, I remember. It changed went from an old house to a T14, one of those temporaries.
Oh,
And then they built a real building up in the home economics conclave up there. But it was a wonderful, wonderful school, especially for children who were only children or the last of a few.
right.
And at that time, there were very few that age until the war was over, because most of the men
Yes,
were off to the wars.
right.
So there was quite a span in between the last children in the family and the next.
Right. I know in my family, 7 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you very
So-
much. Very good interview, and I appreciate it.
Yeah.